There is a category of attack whose most dangerous quality is not what it destroys. It is what it creates. A missile destroys a target. A cyber operation, executed with precision against the right system at the right moment, creates an absence. An absence of awareness, of coordination, of the shared picture that modern military operations depend on as completely and as invisibly as they depend on oxygen. You do not feel an absence until it matters. And the moment it matters is the moment someone designed it to matter. The air traffic management system at Andersen Air Force Base on Guam coordinates one of the most complex military aviation environments in the Western Pacific. At any given moment during operational flight periods, the controllers working the Andersen approach and departure corridors are managing a mix of fighter aircraft, maritime patrol planes, tankers, airlift missions, and surveillance assets whose combined flight paths cross, separate, deconflict, and interweave in a pattern that requires continuous automated support to maintain safe separation. The automated support is the system. The controllers work the system. Neither the controllers nor the system are sufficient alone. The combination of human judgment and computational tracking is what keeps aircraft that are flying fast, in limited visibility, on converging headings from occupying the same piece of sky at the same time. What happens when the computational tracking element of that combination produces confident, authoritative, and wrong information is something that every air traffic control safety study ever published has described in consistent terms. The human operators trust the system. They are trained to verify, to cross-check, to maintain independent situational awareness. But in a high workload environment, with multiple simultaneous traffic situations requiring attention, the system's output becomes the dominant frame through which the human operator processes the picture. When the system says the aircraft are separated, the controller manages other priorities. The controller trusts what the system shows. The People's Liberation Army, Strategic Support Force Cyber Operations Directorate, had been studying the Andersen ATC system for 22 months. They had not been studying it because they wanted to disrupt commercial aviation over Guam. They had been studying it because they understood that the system was the keystone of a specific vulnerability in U.S. Pacific air operations. A vulnerability that existed at the intersection of the system's architecture, the operational tempo of a carrier strike group conducting combat exercises, and the precise 47-minute window during which two P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft would be executing their handover procedure in the Andersen approach corridor during a shift change in the carrier group's airborne ISR coverage. The handover procedure was not classified. It was documented in the unclassified portion of Andersen's published airspace management protocols, a document that existed because commercial aviation authorities required it. The protocol described the standard approach sequencing for P-8A aircraft transitioning between patrol stations, the altitude deconfliction requirements, and the timing windows during which the approach corridor would have maximum traffic density. It was published because transparency about military airspace management procedures reduced the risk of civilian aviation conflicts in the crowded Pacific airspace. It was published, and the PLA had read it and understood that for 47 minutes during each shift change rotation, two large maritime patrol aircraft would be in the same approach corridor within a compressed altitude band, executing a coordinated handover of their surveillance responsibilities while their onboard crews were managing the cognitive transition between incoming and outgoing watch teams. The aircraft would be in the corridor. They would be in communication with Andersen ATC. They would be receiving traffic separation advisories from the automated tracking system. And the automated tracking system, at the moment the PLA intended to exploit this window, would be showing each aircraft a picture of the other aircraft's position that was wrong by a margin calculated to produce a loss of separation event. A loss of separation event between two P-8A Poseidon aircraft in the Andersen approach corridor at the moment of a carrier strike would not destroy the aircraft. The probability of an actual mid-air collision from a loss of separation event was not the point. The point was what would happen in the 3 to 8 minutes between the moment the controllers detected the separation error and the moment the situation was resolved. 3 to 8 minutes during which every controller in the Andersen facility would be focused on the traffic conflict, during which the automated system's reliability would be in question, during which the P-8A crews would be executing emergency separation maneuvers, and during which the surveillance coverage handover between the two aircraft would be incomplete, creating a 43 nautical mile gap in the ISR picture covering the western approaches to the carrier strike group's operating position. 43 nautical miles of uncovered ocean, into which the PLA intended to send a strike package. The cyber intrusion that would produce the false tracking data had been planted in the Andersen ATC automation system's secondary data fusion module 17 months earlier, during a routine software update cycle. The update had been delivered through a supply chain compromise. A software vendor whose maintenance access credentials had been compromised through a spear phishing operation 9 months before that, giving the PLA access to the vendor's code-signing infrastructure and the ability to introduce a small, precisely written payload into a legitimate update package. The payload was dormant. It contained no malicious behavior. It simply existed in the data fusion module, waiting for a trigger signal transmitted on a frequency that the module's communication stack processed as routine calibration traffic. The trigger would activate a position offset function, a module that would introduce a calculated error into the altitude and lateral position data that the system reported for 2 specific aircraft transponder codes during a defined time window. The offset was not random. It had been computed against the specific approach geometry of the handover procedure to produce a false separation picture that would require controller intervention without immediately revealing itself as a system error rather than a genuine traffic conflict. The operation had been planned for a Thursday morning when the carrier strike group was conducting its scheduled exercise series, and the P-8A handover was scheduled to occur at 4:15 a.m. The PLA strike package, 16D F-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles launched from mobile platforms in Fujian and Guangdong provinces, timed to reach the carrier's operating position during the ISR gap, had been positioned and ready for 72 hours. The intrusion was detected at 11:47 p.m. on the Wednesday evening, 4 hours and 28 minutes before the trigger was scheduled to activate. It was detected not by a cybersecurity system and not by a software audit. It was detected by the Andersen Air Traffic Control Facility's own maintenance technician, who had been troubleshooting an unrelated timing synchronization issue in the data fusion module for the preceding 3 hours, and who had, in the course of that work, observed a subroutine executing in the module's memory space that was not in the documented build manifest for the current software version. The subroutine was small, 41 lines of compiled code. It was not executing. It was resident, but it was not supposed to be there. He flagged it to the facility's cybersecurity officer at 11:47 p.m. The cybersecurity officer had the code isolated and transmitted to the Air Force Cyber Emergency Response Team at 12:04 a.m. The CERT team had the preliminary analysis complete by 12:49 a.m. The code was a dormant position offset module with a trigger architecture consistent with supply chain compromise techniques documented in classified threat assessments of PLA cyber operations. The module was scheduled to activate at 4:15 a.m. Its target transponder codes corresponded to the P-8A aircraft assigned to the Thursday morning patrol handover. The analysis reached Pacific Air Forces Command at 1:06 a.m. The decision made at 1:15 a.m. was the decision that changed everything that followed. The module would not be removed. Its trigger architecture would be studied and understood before the window closed. The P-8A handover would be rescheduled to a different corridor in time under the cover of a routine weather advisory. And the false picture the module was designed to create would be fed back into the system in a modified form. Not the picture the PLA had engineered to create the ISR gap, but a picture designed to make the PLA strike planners believe the gap had been created on schedule. The modification required the Andersen systems operators to manually introduce false position data for the two P-8A transponder codes during the 4:15 a.m. window, simulating the controller response behavior that a genuine loss of separation event would generate, including the expected communication traffic, the expected aircraft maneuver commands, and the expected duration of the disruption. Every element of the false picture had to be consistent with what the PLA's monitoring systems would expect to see during a genuine ATC conflict scenario. The P-8A aircraft themselves were rerouted at 3:45 a.m. under the weather advisory cover. Their actual patrol positions placed them not in the compromised approach corridor, but in an extended coverage orbit that maintained complete ISR coverage of the western approaches to the carrier's operating position throughout the window. The carrier group was not blind. It had never been intended to be blind. The picture it was showing to anyone watching the Andersen systems communications traffic was a picture of confusion, of controllers managing a separation event, of aircraft executing conflict resolution maneuvers, of a 43 nautical mile surveillance gap opening exactly as the PLA had calculated it would. At 4:15 a.m., the Andersen systems communications traffic began generating exactly what the PLA monitoring expected: controller calls, aircraft transponder responses, altitude deconfliction instructions, the behavioral signature of a system managing a genuine traffic conflict. At 4:17 a.m., the PLA strike package launched 16 DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles from mobile platforms in Fugan and Guangdong, rising simultaneously on trajectories that the space-based infrared sensor network detected within 11 seconds of the first launch. The launch signatures reached Pacific Fleet at 4:17 a.m. and 44 seconds. The carrier strike group's Aegis systems were already at full active posture. They had been at full active posture since 1:30 a.m., when the preliminary analysis from the CRT team had provided sufficient confidence to warrant a covert pre-launch defensive reconfiguration conducted under the cover of a scheduled system maintenance window that the strike group's routine log would show as unremarkable. The P-8A aircraft in their actual positions were already building targeting data on the mobile launcher platforms. Their radar and signals intelligence systems had been tracking the platform's movement patterns for 48 hours and had, by 4:10 a.m., established position fixes on all 6 of the launcher clusters with a confidence level sufficient to preload strike coordinates. 2 A-18F Super Hornets had been holding at altitude since 3:50 a.m., assigned a strike package against the launcher positions, and waiting for the authorization that would come at the moment the missiles launched. The authorization transmitted at 4:17 a.m. and 52 seconds, 8 seconds after the launch signatures were confirmed. The Aegis engagement of the 16 DF-21D missiles began in the boost phase. The SM-3 Block 2A intercepts, launched from 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers and 2 Burke-class destroyers in the outer screen, targeted the missiles during their ascent, the engagement window that offered the most favorable intercept geometry and the greatest distance from the carrier. 11 of the 16 were engaged and removed from the battle space in the boost and midcourse phases. 5 completed their reentry trajectories. The 5 terminal phase threats were the DF-21D's most dangerous aspect: a maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed to evade the engagement solutions that standard ballistic intercept geometry produced. Each re-entry vehicle was independently maneuvering on a terminal approach profile that required the defending Aegis systems to continuously update their intercept solutions against a target that was changing its velocity vector in 3 dimensions while accelerating through the lower atmosphere. The engagement required 4 SM-6 launches in terminal ballistic intercept mode and 1 THAAD intercept from the battery in Guam that had been activated at 1:45 a.m. as part of the covert defensive reconfiguration. 3 of the 5 were intercepted by SM-6. One was intercepted by THAAD at an altitude that placed the debris field over open ocean. The fifth maneuvering reentry vehicle executed a terminal guidance correction at 41,000 feet that altered its approach vector by 17 degrees. A correction that moved it outside the pre-computed engagement envelope of the SM-6 assigned to its track. The SM-6 tracking team had 4.3 seconds to execute a manual solution update and retarget the interceptor. The update was executed in 3.8 seconds. The intercept occurred at 4:23 a.m. and 7 seconds, at an altitude that put the debris field at 18 nautical miles from the carrier's position. The carrier had been in a maximum speed evasive maneuver since 4:19 a.m. By 4:23 a.m., it was 6 nautical miles from its position at the moment the DF-21Ds launched. The maneuvering re-entry vehicle had been aimed at where the carrier was. Its corrected terminal approach had been aimed at where the carrier would have been if it had maintained course. It was not where it had been, and it was not where it would have been. It was 6 nautical miles away from both those positions, moving at 28 knots on a heading that the strike planners had not modeled. The debris field from the intercepted 5th re-entry vehicle fell into empty ocean. Simultaneously, the F/A-18F Super Hornets reached their strike coordinates. The launcher platforms had been moving since the launch. Standard DPRK and PLA doctrine for mobile ballistic missile operations is to displace immediately after launch, recognizing that the launch signature creates a targeting opportunity. The platforms had been moving for 6 minutes. The P-8A targeting updates, transmitted to the Super Hornets every 90 seconds throughout the flight, had tracked the movement. The strike coordinates in the Super Hornet systems reflected the platform's actual positions at the moment of weapons release, not their launch positions. All 6 launcher clusters were struck between 4:24 a.m. and 4:31 a.m. The battle damage assessment, compiled from P-8A post-strike imagery, confirmed all 6 clusters as rendered inoperable. 2 additional vehicles, a command relay element that had been associated with the operation, and a logistics vehicle that the pre-strike intelligence had identified as carrying reload munitions for 2 of the launcher clusters, were engaged by follow-on strikes at 4:34 a.m. At 4:35 a.m., the Andersen ATC facility's communications traffic transitioned from its simulated conflict response behavior back to normal operations. The transition was timed and phrased to be consistent with a resolved separation event. Controllers confirming the traffic had been separated, aircraft confirming their positions, the routine closing language of an incident that had been managed and put behind. The PLA monitoring systems, if they were still watching, would see an ATC facility that had experienced the disruption their operation had designed and had returned to normal. What the PLA monitoring systems would not see was the 41 lines of dormant code in the Andersen Data Fusion module that were now fully documented, forensically attributed to the supply chain compromise vector, and in the hands of the Air Force Cyber Command analysis teams who would spend the following 6 weeks tracing the compromise pathway back to its origin in the software vendor's code signing infrastructure. And from there, to the spear phishing operation that had obtained the vendor's credentials 26 months before this Thursday morning. The code had been in the system for 17 months and had been invisible for 17 months. It had become visible at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Because a maintenance technician was troubleshooting a timing synchronization issue and saw 41 lines in a memory space where there should have been none. At 5 a.m., the carrier resumed its exercise schedule. The morning's first aircraft launched at 5:15 a.m. The P-8A aircraft transitioned back into the Andersen approach corridor from their rerouted positions, completing the handover that had been delayed by 83 minutes. The controllers who had spent the past hour simulating a traffic conflict that had never occurred updated their logs, cleared their boards, and began managing the actual traffic that needed managing. At 5:30 a.m., the maintenance technician who had found the code at 11:47 p.m. submitted his incident report. It described the timing synchronization issue he had been troubleshooting the anomalous subroutine he had found in the process of resolving it, and the steps he had taken after finding it. The report was thorough and precise. It took 11 minutes to complete. When he filed it, he closed the maintenance log for the data fusion module, initiated a full software integrity audit of all secondary modules in the system, and went to get coffee. The audit would find nothing further. The supply chain compromise had been limited to a single module. The technician completed the audit at 7:15 a.m., certified the system as clean, and returned to the timing synchronization issue he had originally been working on. He resolved it at 8:30 a.m. It had been caused by a firmware version mismatch in a peripheral communications board. A routine maintenance item. Now the accounting. 17 months of dormant code in the Andersen ATC data fusion module. 41 lines of position offset programming waiting for a trigger signal. 4 hours and 28 minutes between detection at 11:47 p.m. and scheduled activation at 4:15 a.m. 16 DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles launched from 6 mobile launcher clusters. 11 intercepted in boost and mid-course phases by SM-3. 4 maneuvering reentry vehicles intercepted in terminal phase by SM-6 and THAAD. 1/5 reentry vehicle requiring a manual SM-6 solution update in 3.8 seconds at a 4.3 second deadline. 1 intercepted 18 nautical miles from carrier position. 6 launcher clusters rendered inoperable by A-18F strike between 4:24 and 4:31 a.m. 0 ships struck. 0 critical casualties. 1 maintenance technician troubleshooting a timing synchronization issue who found 41 lines that did not belong there. The PLA operation had addressed every visible element of the defensive architecture it intended to exploit. The ATC system vulnerability was real. The handover window was real. The ISR gap that would have been created was real. The operation failed at the single point its designers had assessed as least likely to be a problem. The dormant code. Code that was not executing. Code that had been in the system for 17 months without detection. Code that was invisible by design. In a module that no standard security scan was specifically tasked to examine. Found by a technician who was not looking for it, and who found it because the maintenance work he was doing took him precisely to the memory space where it was sitting. In cyber operations, a dormant payload is only as invisible as the unrelated work that nobody does near it. The PLA's operation was 17 months of patience and 26 months of preparation. It was undone at 11:47 p.m. by a timing synchronization issue in a peripheral communications board that had nothing to do with any of it. The Pacific holds its depth below the flight paths and the missile trajectories and the controller communications. Below all of it, the water is the same water it has always been. What happens above it is determined by the people who watch most carefully and the problems they choose to fix.